This is the third part of the Chapter 1 lecture notes. We are starting with slide 41, and in this section we have 61 slides, so hopefully we can cover slides 41 through 61 in this video. Okay, so section 1.4 is on homeostasis, and homeostasis is going to be a theme throughout this entire course. Every body system is designed to maintain homeostasis. So it's defined as the maintenance of relatively stable internal conditions despite continuous changes in the environment. Okay. So in order to maintain, to regulate and maintain homeostasis, our body must consistently or constantly be monitored. The nervous and the endocrine systems play a major role. And when we talk about homeostasis, we usually do it in terms of variables. These are factors that can change. And when they change, we say, that homeostasis has been disrupted. And they're maintained by this process of homeostasis. Blood sugar or blood glucose is what we typically call it in medicine. And then because glucose is just the specific type of sugar that's found in our blood. Body temperature is maintained by homeostasis. The volume of our blood, for example, heart rate, blood pressure, these are different variables, okay? So we're going to talk about maintaining these variables with three components: a receptor, a control center, and an effector. The receptor is the sensor. The receptor is what monitors the environment and responds to the stimuli. The control center receives that information and determines the appropriate response. The effector receives output from the control center. The control center basically tells it what to do, and it provides the response. The response is either going to, it says reduce the stimulus, but it's either going to be opposite to the stimulus, and that would be negative feedback. Or it's going to enhance the stimulus, and that would be positive feedback. So negative feedback is mostly the mechanism that's used to maintain homeostasis. In fact, positive feedback, the only examples I can really think of are labor and blood clotting. But negative feedback is used to maintain variables within a healthy range for almost all the other variables, for almost all the other conditions. So examples are regulating body temperature, regulating blood glucose. There are many other examples. Blood pressure is another one. Regulating a lot of the chemical levels in the blood, like blood oxygen levels, blood carbon dioxide levels, the levels of certain ions in the blood. But anyway, what happens with the way negative feedback works with blood sugar, the receptors sense increased blood glucose. So that's step one. The control center is the pancreas, and it secretes insulin into the blood. And then the insulin causes this body cells, which are the effectors in this example, to absorb more glucose. The body cells are typically going to be the liver cells and the muscle cells, but they're going to absorb more glucose from the blood, and that will lower the blood glucose levels. So when our stimulus is increased blood glucose, the response is decreasing blood glucose. So that's the opposite. That's doing the opposite of the initial stimulus. And that's what happens with negative feedback. I'm going to skip that. All right, and we have another example, which is body temperature. when everything's in balance, we have a pendulum here. So when everything's in balance, we don't have any need for negative feedback. But let's say that the stimulus is heat, causes the body temperature to rise. And when the body temperature rises, there are receptors which are found in the skin and the brain that are sensitive to temperature. They're going to send the information. I didn't mean for that to draw a line, but they're going to send the information to the control center, which is in the brain. It happens to be in the hypothalamus, which is in the brain. But the control center is going to send information to, for example, the sweat glands is not the only effector, but in this case, we're just looking at sweat glands as the effectors. And the information is gonna cause you to sweat more, and then evaporation of that sweat is going to lower the body temperature. So the response is to lower the temperature. The stimulus was high temperature. The response is to lower it. So that is negative feedback. And then you can look at the example where the body temperature falls on your own. This slide is slide number 53. Okay, and then positive feedback is when the initial stimulus is enhanced until whatever the process is, until it's over. So labor, for example, is an example of positive feedback. So when you start having the contractions of labor, they're going to get stronger, and then they're going to get stronger, and then they're going to get stronger. They get enhanced over and over and over again, and this is controlled by the release of oxytocin. When blood begins to clot, it begins to clot more and more and more and more until the clot is formed. So, and that is called platelet plug formation, and that's controlled by clotting factors and other things. So positive feedback is when the response enhances or exaggerates the original stimulus until the event is over, until homeostasis has been reached. So this shows you a positive feedback mechanism for forming a platelet plug, which is going to lead to a blood clot. So we have a tear in a blood vessel. That's our initial stimulus. The tear releases chemicals that start this positive feedback cycle. Step 2, platelets, which are found in our blood. They're fragments of blood cells. We call them platelets or thrombocytes, adhere to the site and release chemicals. Some of the same chemicals that were released by the tissues that were torn. And those chemicals are going to cause the release of, they're going to cause more platelets to be attracted to the area of the wound. And this cycle is just going to go on and on and on. More chemicals, more platelets, more chemicals, more platelets, until you have a plug that has stopped the bleeding. And this is just step by step. Okay, so really what the problem with homeostatic imbalance, when homeostasis is disturbed, it increases the risk of disease. For example, I have type 2 diabetes, and my blood glucose levels over the past few weeks were higher than they should be. That increases my risk for heart disease, kidney disease, problems with my eyes. Many of us know a lot about diabetes because there's a lot of people with diabetes in this country, in the world, but we know that increases the risk of disease when our blood glucose levels are not maintained. So disturbing homeostasis increases the risk of disease, contributes to changes associated with aging. Our control systems, our brain and our endocrine system become less efficient. If negative feedback mechanisms become overwhelmed, destructive positive feedback mechanisms may take over. And that can lead to, heart failure, for example. Now we are going into the second set of slides. The slides are just divided up into I don't know why I just hit paste. Slideshow from current slide. Okay, but the second set of slides, we're just going to continue on with them. This is going to be more focused on the anatomical terms or the medical terminology portion that you need to know. In section 1.5, anatomical terms, you're going to need to know terms that relate to the anatomical position, and directional terms like, superior and inferior. We're going to start with the anatomical position. When we say that a person is in the anatomical position, we are saying that their body is erect, they're standing up, their feet are slightly apart, their palms are facing forward, the thumbs are pointing away from the body. And so that's very important for you to know, is the anatomical position. And then directional terms are going to describe, these are very, very important. They're going to be used to help you describe to somebody else where something is located in relation to other body structures. And when we use these directional terms, we are assuming that the person is in the anatomical position, okay? Right and left, when we use the terms right and left, we're referring to the body that's being viewed, not the right and left of the observer. Some of the orientation and directional terms are in this table. Make sure that you know superior and inferior. Superior is toward the head and inferior is toward the feet. We can also use cranial and caudal for a human who stands upright. I mean, if we were talking about an animal, it would be different because they are on all fours. So superior would actually be toward the back, and inferior would be toward the stomach. But since we stand upright, cranial, the head region, is the superior structure. It's the most, the structure that's the highest up, okay? So the inferior is the caudal direction. Anterior and ventral mean the same thing, and that means toward the stomach region or toward the front. And then posterior and dorsal mean the same thing, and that means toward the back. Medial means toward the midline of the body, and lateral means toward the sides. So let's look at these for an example, okay? It says the arms are lateral to the chest. So the chest is more medial to the arms. And that's how you use these kinds of terms. We can also look at the fingers. The thumbs are lateral to the little finger or the pinky. The pinky is medial to the thumb. And then we have intermediate, and we don't hardly ever use that, but between a more medial and more lateral structure. Intermediate is, I can give you an example. We have the vastus lateralis, the vastus medialis, and then the vastus intermediate. I think it's intermedius. I can't remember. There's a muscle in between the vastus lateralis and vastus medialis. These are the quadriceps muscles. There's one, the vastus lateralis, which is toward the outside of your thigh, and then the vastus medialis is toward the medial side, the inner side of your thigh, and then there's one intermediate to that that's in between the vastus medialis and vastus lateralis. We would definitely get to that in the muscle chapter. And then we have these terms which can be difficult, proximal and distal, because they are in relation to a joint. So proximal means close to the joint, distal means far from the joint. So if the joint, for example, is the shoulder joint, we would say the elbow is proximal to the wrist because it is closer to the shoulder joint than the wrist is. If we switched it around, we would say the wrist is distal to the elbow because the wrist is more distant or far from the shoulder than the elbow is. Then we have superficial, which means closer to the surface or the skin, and deep means deeper into the body tissues and further away from the skin. The two major divisions of the body, we're getting into regional terms. The axial region is the head, neck, and trunk. The appendicular region would include the legs and the arms. And you need to know all of these terms. And so I'm going to stop here, and we will start the next recording with the regional terms for the body areas.